The operating room doors had barely stopped swinging when the first angry voice shattered the disciplined silence of the military hospital. A 4-star general lay on the trauma table with blood soaking through layers of emergency dressings, and every passing second erased another chance to keep him alive. Before anyone reached for another instrument, a colonel slammed his fist against the steel cabinet and barked that only the hospital's chief trauma surgeon was authorized to touch the patient. The fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over polished floors still marked by muddy boot prints from the helicopter crew that had carried the wounded officer inside. Antiseptic filled the air so sharply that it seemed to sting the lungs, blending with the metallic scent of fresh blood and the rhythmic beeping of monitors that refused to slow for anyone's fear. Nurses moved with disciplined urgency, opening sterile packs, counting instruments, adjusting ventilator settings, while surgeons from neighboring departments gathered just beyond the glass, their faces tense beneath protective masks. In the center of the controlled storm stood a young combat nurse whose uniform carried fewer decorations than nearly everyone around her. Her sleeves were neatly rolled beneath a sterile gown, her dark hair tucked perfectly beneath a surgical cap, and her calm eyes never drifted toward the shouting officers. She simply studied the injuries before her with the quiet concentration of someone reading a familiar language. On a chain beneath her scrubs rested an old military challenge coin that occasionally pressed against her chest whenever she leaned over the patient. No one noticed it. No one cared. They were too busy questioning why she had not stepped aside. The general's blood pressure continued falling despite every intervention. A medic whispered the latest numbers, and they were worse than anyone wanted to hear. A torn subclavian artery. Massive internal bleeding. Fragment wounds scattered across the chest. Minutes, perhaps less. The chief surgeon, Colonel Richard Mason, had been returning from an overseas medical conference when severe weather forced his aircraft to divert hundreds of miles away. Communication had become unreliable. No one knew when, or even if, he could reach the hospital in time. Yet the senior officers refused to accept reality. They repeated his name as though saying it often enough might somehow make him appear. The young nurse finally spoke, and her voice carried none of the panic surrounding her. She requested another unit of blood, ordered additional vascular clamps, and quietly asked anesthesia to prepare for profound blood loss. Her words were so steady that several members of the surgical staff instinctively followed them before realizing who had given the instructions. The colonel turned toward her with disbelief. He demanded to know who had authorized her to issue commands. She answered without looking away from the patient. The authorization, she said, came from the fact that the general would die if everyone kept arguing. A silence settled over the room for only a heartbeat before another protest erupted. One senior physician insisted they wait another 5 minutes for confirmation from headquarters. Another recommended transferring the patient by helicopter to a larger military medical center despite the obvious impossibility. The nurse listened to every objection while continuing her assessment. Her gloved fingers located another expanding hematoma beneath the clavicle. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew exactly what it meant. She had seen the same pattern before, though never inside a spotless operating room. She had seen it beneath shredded tents during sandstorms where electricity disappeared without warning. She had seen it by flashlight while helicopters circled overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath folding tables. Those memories did not arrive as dramatic flashes. They settled quietly behind her eyes, guiding her hands with practiced certainty. A young resident standing beside her noticed the confidence with which she traced the anatomy through swollen tissue. He had assisted world-renowned surgeons, yet something about her movements felt strangely familiar. She did not hesitate where textbooks predicted uncertainty. She anticipated complications before monitors revealed them. It was as though she had rehearsed this exact operation dozens of times. Across the room, a military police officer entered carrying a sealed case recovered from the helicopter. Inside rested the general's service pistol, identification, and several personal effects. While inventory was completed, the challenge coin slipped briefly from beneath the nurse's collar as she leaned forward to secure another line. The resident caught a glimpse of it. Its edges had been worn smooth by years of use, and engraved into its surface was the insignia of a classified combat medical task force that officially no longer existed. Before he could study it further, it disappeared beneath the fabric again. His curiosity lingered, but there was no time to ask questions. The monitor emitted a warning tone. Blood pressure dropped again. Oxygen saturation began to slide. The anesthesiologist announced that the patient was becoming increasingly unstable. Around the room, conversation stopped. Reality had finally silenced rank. Every pair of eyes turned toward the operating table. The colonel swallowed hard before making one last attempt to stop her. He reminded everyone that she was a nurse, not the chief surgeon they had requested, and that failure would become the most investigated medical disaster in modern military history. She acknowledged every word without resentment. Then she asked him a single question. If waiting guaranteed the general's death, who would accept responsibility for doing nothing? No one answered. The ticking wall clock suddenly sounded louder than the machines. 1 second. 2. 3. Every member of the surgical team understood that indecision had become its own fatal choice. The chief anesthesiologist slowly looked around the room before nodding once. The scrub technician pushed the instrument tray closer. Another surgeon stepped silently beside the young nurse instead of in front of her. One by one, without speeches or ceremony, the room chose action over reputation. The colonel lowered his eyes, unable to speak. Outside the operating suite, more officers gathered behind reinforced observation glass, whispering anxious predictions about careers that would end before sunrise if the unknown nurse failed. Inside, none of that noise existed anymore. Only the patient mattered. She extended her hand without taking her eyes off the wound. The scrub technician hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second before placing a scalpel into her palm. It rested there as naturally as though it had always belonged. Her grip never trembled. The room became perfectly still. Even the heart monitor seemed to wait. She positioned the blade over the precise point where seconds separated life from death, drew one slow breath, and just as the first incision was about to begin, the operating room doors burst open and an exhausted voice shouted words that caused every head to turn before the scalpel could touch the general's skin. The shout echoed across the operating room with enough force to freeze every pair of hands in place. A breathless major stood in the doorway, his uniform damp from rain and streaked with mud from the helicopter pad. He looked first at the general on the table, then at the young combat nurse holding the scalpel. His eyes widened with recognition rather than alarm. Before anyone could demand an explanation, he spoke with a calm certainty that carried farther than the frantic voices that had filled the room moments earlier. He told them to let her work. Every officer in the room stared at him in disbelief. The colonel immediately challenged his authority, insisting that military protocol did not permit a nurse to perform a procedure this complex. The major answered with only one sentence. Protocol would not keep the general alive. Skill might. The words settled into the silence with uncomfortable weight. The heart monitor interrupted the moment with another warning tone. Blood pressure continued to fall. There was no more time for argument. The young nurse did not waste a second responding to the debate unfolding around her. She lowered the scalpel with complete precision, opened the incision exactly where the expanding hematoma demanded, and immediately exposed the source of the catastrophic bleeding. Blood surged into the surgical field, but instead of recoiling, she moved with astonishing confidence. Her left hand compressed the damaged vessel, while her right requested a vascular clamp before anyone else had even recognized what she had found. The scrub technician passed the instrument almost instinctively. It was as though the entire team had slipped into a rhythm that centered around her voice. She issued instructions without raising her volume. More suction. Retractor slightly higher. Increase blood flow. Prepare another graft. Each request came seconds before the need became obvious, leaving experienced surgeons exchanging uncertain glances over their masks. One senior physician quietly admitted to himself that she was operating several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Outside the observation window, nervous officers pressed closer to the glass. None of them understood why the operation had not been stopped. Rumors spread rapidly through the hallway. Some believed headquarters had secretly authorized her. Others feared desperation had replaced judgment. Inside the operating suite, neither rumor mattered. The general's heartbeat weakened again. A monitor released a sharp, continuous alarm before suddenly returning to an irregular rhythm. The anesthesiologist announced significant cardiac instability. Another 30 seconds without controlling the bleeding could end everything. The young nurse leaned closer over the table. Sweat formed beneath her surgical cap, but her breathing remained slow and measured. Every movement conserved energy. Every decision carried purpose. She had learned long ago that panic was contagious, but so was calm. The operating room gradually reflected her composure. Voices became quieter. Motions became smoother. Fear gave way to concentration. As the damaged artery finally came into full view, one of the assisting surgeons frowned in confusion. The injury pattern looked unlike anything normally caused by an accident. There were tiny fragments lodged in places that suggested an explosion rather than a vehicle collision. The nurse noticed his expression without looking away from her work. She explained that the fragment trajectory matched an improvised explosive device. The surgeon stared at her. Those details had never been released. She should not have known them. Before he could ask how, she requested a finer needle and began reconstructing the torn vessel with delicate movements so steady they barely disturbed the surrounding tissue. Every stitch landed perfectly. It was not merely technical ability. It was muscle memory built under circumstances far harsher than this spotless operating room. The colonel watched from across the table, his certainty beginning to fracture. He had entered the room believing rank defined competence. Now he found himself silently following the instructions of the very person he had tried to remove. His hands passed instruments exactly when she needed them. Without realizing it, he had become part of her team. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The bleeding slowed. Blood pressure climbed by a fraction. Then another complication appeared. A hidden fragment shifted dangerously near the heart. One careless movement could puncture the vessel she had just repaired. The room tightened with renewed tension. Even the ventilator seemed louder. She studied the fragment without touching it. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed deeply. The silence stretched until the only sound left was the steady electronic rhythm of the cardiac monitor. It was the quietest moment of the entire operation. Fear hung in the air, invisible but unmistakable. Then, with extraordinary patience, she adjusted the angle of one instrument by only a few millimeters and gently lifted the fragment free. The monitor answered with a stronger heartbeat. Relief swept across the room without anyone daring to celebrate. The danger had not passed. It had merely changed. As the final repair continued, the major who had interrupted the surgery quietly approached the colonel. From his pocket he removed an old photograph sealed inside a weathered protective sleeve. It showed a makeshift battlefield operating station years earlier. Dust covered everything. Medical tents leaned under heavy wind. Standing beside a younger Colonel Richard Mason was the same woman now performing surgery, though she looked several years younger, and wore the insignia of an elite forward surgical response unit that had officially been dissolved after one of the most dangerous rescue campaigns in military history. On the back of the photograph were handwritten words in Mason's unmistakable handwriting. "If I am ever absent, trust Lieutenant Evelyn Carter with every life placed in her hands. She already carries the judgment of a surgeon. She simply wears different insignia." The colonel read the sentence twice before lowering the photograph. His expression shifted from disbelief to quiet shame. All this time he had searched for the famous surgeon, never realizing the surgeon's greatest legacy had been standing in front of him since the operation began. Across the room the young combat nurse completed another delicate repair, never aware that the truth of her past had finally reached the people who had doubted her. The heart rhythm stabilized for the first time since the general had entered the hospital. A cautious wave of hope spread through the team. Yet before anyone could believe the crisis was ending, the anesthesiologist looked up from the monitor with an expression no one wanted to see. The general's brain activity had begun to change in a way that suggested the operation had uncovered something far more serious than hidden shrapnel, and the scans arriving from radiology revealed a discovery that transformed the surgery from a desperate attempt to save a wounded soldier into the opening chapter of a secret the military had buried for years. The radiology images appeared on the monitor with a quiet electronic hum, and every conversation inside the operating room dissolved into silence. The scans revealed that the fragment lodged near the general's heart was not the greatest threat after all. Hidden beneath scar tissue was evidence of an older injury, one that had healed imperfectly years before and had remained concealed through countless physical examinations. The new trauma had torn open that forgotten wound, turning yesterday's secret into today's emergency. Several senior physicians exchanged stunned looks because the scar matched an operation performed during a classified overseas mission that officially did not exist. The room understood at once that this surgery had become more than a race against time. It had become a collision between hidden history and present survival. The young combat nurse did not allow the revelation to distract her. Her attention remained fixed on the fragile rhythm pulsing across the cardiac monitor. Every stitch she placed seemed almost effortless, guided by years of experience earned where clean hospitals had been replaced by shattered buildings and sterile lights by the glow of portable lanterns. Around her, the tension slowly transformed into trust. Nobody questioned her instructions anymore. Instruments reached her hand before she even requested them. Blood products arrived exactly when they were needed. The operating room had become a single coordinated heartbeat, and at its center stood the person everyone had underestimated only an hour before. Outside the reinforced glass, officers who had once demanded her removal now watched without speaking. Their rigid confidence had given way to quiet reflection. They had mistaken youth for inexperience, rank for wisdom, and appearance for ability. None of them could undo those assumptions now. They could only witness the consequences of them. The final repair required extraordinary precision. The damaged vessel rested beside delicate cardiac tissue where even the smallest error would end the general's life. The nurse paused for a single measured breath before making the last sequence of sutures. Her hands never trembled. The monitors remained steady. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes until at last the repaired vessel held firm. The bleeding stopped. Blood pressure climbed. Oxygen levels improved. One by one, the alarms that had dominated the room since the beginning of the operation fell silent. For the first time that day, hope no longer felt borrowed. It felt real. Relief washed across exhausted faces, but celebration never came. Military medicine had taught them that survival was earned slowly, never assumed. As anesthesia was gradually reduced, everyone waited for the smallest sign that the general's mind had survived alongside his body. His fingers moved first. Then his breathing deepened. Finally, his eyes opened. Though still weak, they searched the room with remarkable clarity before settling on the young combat nurse. A faint smile appeared beneath the oxygen mask, so slight that anyone else might have missed it. His voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet every person in the room heard him. He asked if Lieutenant Evelyn Carter had been the one holding the scalpel. She answered simply that she had. The general closed his eyes for a brief moment, not from exhaustion but from gratitude. When he looked at the surrounding officers again, he spoke with quiet certainty. He told them there had never been a better choice. Years earlier, during the classified mission whose records remain sealed, she had saved an entire evacuation team after an explosion destroyed their field hospital. Supplies had run out. Communications had failed. Senior surgeons had been killed. She had continued operating for nearly 20 hours without stopping, saving soldiers whose names history would never know. Among them had been the general himself. He admitted that she had asked for no recognition, accepted no medals beyond those required by regulation, and quietly requested reassignment to ordinary hospital duty because she believed saving lives mattered more than being remembered for doing it. The room fell into another silence, but this one carried no fear. It carried humility. Colonel Richard Mason finally entered the operating suite, still wearing the travel-worn uniform from his interrupted journey. He had driven through the night after learning the general had been wounded, arriving only minutes after the surgery ended. Instead of asking for a report, he walked directly toward Evelyn Carter. Without speaking, he removed his surgical cap and extended his hand. She accepted it with respectful hesitation. Mason smiled with unmistakable pride before turning toward the assembled officers. He explained that years earlier he had stopped teaching Evelyn because there was nothing left to teach. She had surpassed instruction through compassion, discipline, and experience no classroom could ever provide. The skills everyone had admired during the operation were not extraordinary because they belonged to a genius. They were extraordinary because they belonged to someone who had never stopped learning after every life she could save and every life she could not. The colonel who had challenged her authority stepped forward with visible regret. He attempted an apology, but the words faltered before they reached completion. Evelyn spared him the discomfort. She simply told him that the patient was alive, and that was enough. There was no anger in her voice. No triumph. Only quiet relief. Her response left a deeper impression than any accusation could have. In that simple act of grace, everyone present learned a lesson no formal military lecture could have delivered. Respect earned through humility lasts far longer than respect demanded by rank. As the general was transferred safely toward intensive care, the corridors outside the operating room gradually returned to their familiar rhythm. Stretchers rolled past. Telephones rang. Nurses hurried between wards carrying medications and charts. Life continued with little awareness that history had quietly unfolded behind one set of closed doors. Evelyn removed her gloves, washed the traces of blood from her hands, and slipped the worn challenge coin back beneath her uniform. It rested over her heart exactly where it had before the operation began. No reporters waited outside. No ceremony had been arranged. She collected her notes, checked on another recovering patient, and resumed the ordinary duties of her shift as though nothing remarkable had happened. Several younger nurses watched her disappear down the hallway, carrying themselves a little differently after witnessing what quiet excellence looked like. Long after the operating room had been cleaned and the instruments sterilized, one sentence continued to echo in the minds of everyone who had stood beside that table. The strongest hands are often the ones that never reach for applause. Weeks later, when the general returned to the hospital on his own feet, he requested only one privilege before leaving. He asked to thank the nurse who had refused to let fear decide his future. They shared only a brief conversation, a respectful salute, and a grateful smile before parting. Neither needed more words. Some debts are too profound for language, and some acts of courage become permanent long before anyone tells their story. As evening sunlight poured through the hospital windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished floor, Evelyn walked toward another waiting patient with the same calm determination that had carried her through the hardest day of her career, proving that true greatness rarely arrives with loud introductions because it is usually too busy serving others to announce itself. If this story reminded you that kindness, courage, and character are often hidden beneath ordinary uniforms, stay with us for another journey where the quietest heroes leave the deepest footprints.